So we've been hearing a lot of allegations of bad behavior. They're all over the map. And it sparked a conversation about what does and what doesn't cross the line. We want to talk about that tonight with our panelists for Mind the Gap. That's when we take two people from two different generations and get their take on issues of the day. Jerry Agar, a baby boomer and a radio host with News Talk 1010 in Toronto. Jessica Moorhouse, a millennial money expert, blogger, and podcast host. Thank you for joining us both.
Thank you.
Jerry, I'm going to start with you. Let me ask you if it's okay in your mind, in your opinion, to ask someone out on a date if you work with them. And if you do you have to be very clear about the fact that it is a date?
Yeah, I would agree with that last statement that you made. I would also say that you have to take into consideration the power imbalance. I don't think the CEO should be asking the interns out under any circumstance, but for coworkers who are more or less in the same power structure to ask one another out, I don't see that there's anything wrong with that. I think if you're turned down, and if you're turned down politely, which you should be the first time, and you persist, and you've been told, look, we have a working relationship, we're not going to have a personal relationship, and you keep persisting, then it can become harassment. But just the simple matter of asking somebody out, it's a compliment.
Okay, before I turn it over to Jessica, I want to ask you if you have thought the same all along, or has your opinion on that, Jerry, changed in, let's say, the last year, the last 5 years, the last 10?
No, it's always seemed sensible to me that you could be able to ask somebody out on a date. The fact that just simply asking somebody out on a date is harassment is something that is new and, in fact, foolish.
All right, so Jessica, let me ask you, is it okay to ask somebody out, a work colleague, out on a date?
I think if you already have some sort of friendship or a relationship outside of work, maybe you've gone out with some coworkers after work, and that would be an appropriate time, I think, to maybe ask, hey, do you want to hang out one-on-one outside of work? Asking out a coworker at work, it's awkward. It's happened to people I know. It makes the whole office environment kind of unpleasant. I wouldn't say go so far to say there's harassment involved, but it makes it kind of awkward. So I'd say start with a friendship and create a relationship that way, and then, you know, put up some feelers, maybe ask some of the coworkers, hey, are they single? Do you think they'd be interested? And then maybe outside of work, ask if they want to go out.
Are you saying, and just to clarify, that the man or woman who is being asked out may not be able to answer fully when they're at work?
I think so. I mean, it's a place of work. It's a weird dynamic where, you know, you do create personal relationships at work, but at the end of the day, I mean, if someone came up to my cubicle and asked me on a date while I'm working, I'd find that kind of inappropriate and awkward.
Okay, so let me put a further question to you, because you said at work it's a no. What about if that person texted you or sent you an email?
If it's on your work email, I think it should stay professional. If you exchanged personal numbers and you have clearly, have a personal relationship, I think that might be a little bit more appropriate.
All right, so let's move to our next scenario, because we all have heard this past week about a professor in Southern Ontario who has been accused of being insensitive, maybe even bullying a student in class. That student had anxiety issues and had someone working with him to help him get through the class. So knowing some of the details, I remember we don't know all of them, but Jerry, I want to ask you what you think constitutes bullying, and from what we know of that scenario, does it constitute bullying? Because people got up and left the class.
Well, they did, but there's kind of a movement now, students sort of virtue signaling by getting up and leaving classes and expressing all kinds of outrage. But of course, we don't know what happened there. On the few details that we have been given, if they are true, it would seem that the individual, the student, has some issues, and that was made apparent to the professor, who then started mocking the student. And if that's the case, then that is inappropriate. And it would seem as though the university has decided that it is at least worth further investigation. He's suspended, as far as I know.
All right, so where is the line when you have a professor or a teacher and a student, as far as what tone you can use? Can you raise your voice? What has changed as far as that relationship in the classroom of what can and cannot be said? Jessica, I'll start with you on that.
I don't think it's appropriate for a professor to raise their voice or single out a student, especially I think the classroom had like 600 students in there. You know, that is absolutely bullying. I would be crushed. And especially there's the power dynamic. He's in a place of authority, singling out one student in a public setting. I mean, that is just not okay to do, especially if they were to raise their voice as well on top of that.
All right. So in this particular situation, we have a student who has anxiety. What if you had a different kind of student who was maybe challenging you or being mouthy in class. Jerry, is it okay then to raise your voice?
Well, I think it comes down to whether a reasonable professor has determined the person is challenging ideas, which is appropriate while you're at university, or just making it all about themselves and causing the trouble and disturbing the class. So each individual situation is going to be different. But I think there are a lot of people who've been through university who would say there are a few professors who could, get over themselves. They're not as important and lordly as they think they are.
All right. I want to also get to this. At a 2017 YouGov survey in The Economist, looked at whether or who would call something harassment. Younger people will call something harassment that older people, in fact, will not. So, Jessica, in your mind, what is harassment? What is acceptable for you and what isn't? And we'll start with sort of in the workplace.
In the workplace. That is a really complicated thing to answer because I think it is sometimes up to the individual. If you feel uncomfortable, if you feel like there is, an authority figure that's putting you in a situation that you feel in your gut is inappropriate, but, as, someone under them, it's hard to kind of make your voice heard. I mean, there is some, that could be a form of harassment. It really depends.
Can you hug somebody in the workplace these days?
I don't think that's appropriate. No,
not at all. Not in
so.
any circumstance.
I don't think any touching needs to happen in the workplace. No.
Okay, so if it's your birthday and somebody came over to give you a birthday hug, no.
I think if you initiated it, that's fine. If you already have a friendship and a relationship, then that's fine.
And Jerry, where do you stand on that? Can you give somebody a hug in the workplace?
I'm trying to understand why it's okay for her to initiate it, but not somebody else. I mean, if you initiate it, you're hugging them. What's the difference?
Well, I'm saying like opening up your arms and seeing if they also open up their arms.
So, Jerry, where do you stand on that?
You might not be comfortable where I work. There's a lot of hugging going on. I think that that this all comes down, as so many things do, to individuals understanding one another, communicating with one another. I know who I can hug and who I can't hug, who I can talk to in certain ways and who I can't talk to in other ways. And I think you find that out by just sort of communicating with people over time. You come to understand one another. The people who get themselves in trouble are the people who just sort of barge in with how they want to act and interfere with other people's personal spaces before they've taken a minute and a half to get to know them.
Yeah, so they're not very well aware of who that person is and what makes them uncomfortable, or they're not paying attention to those cues.
Yeah, I had an example of a young lady who came on my show once a week as I do a panel in the first hour of my show. She was a young lady, and she came in, and she came into the room the first time with her hand stretched out in front of her. It was very obvious. She wanted to shake hands. That's all she wanted to do. By the time a year later, when she had done the panel for about a year and was moving on, we had already moved to a good morning hug on the days that she came in. But it was a problem. And I being the male, being older, the guy who's in charge of the show, there's a power dynamic there. I really let her determine where all of that was going to go.
All right, guys, I got to leave it there because we've run out of time. But I appreciate you weighing in on this today. It's one of those conversations that keeps evolving. Jerry Agar and Jessica Morehouse, thanks for your time, guys.
Thank you.
Thanks.